Well, greetings everyone, and welcome back from your holiday. Really pleased to have a guest with us today from just a couple doors down from the Crown School. Pleased to have Phil Garboden, who's the associate professor at Crown. And I think Phil, is this your first? This is still your first year? Your second year. Second year. But I still think of him as new. Second year here at the University of Chicago, and Phil's primary research agenda focuses on how supply-side actors, which includes landlords, developers, and property managers, respond to state, local, and federal housing policy in ways that exacerbate structural marginalization of low-income and non-white communities. He's currently working on a book for Princeton called American Landlord, which examines how landlords leverage the uneven power dynamics of low-rent housing markets in ways that affect tenant well-being. So I'll look forward to seeing that book. And prior to coming to Crown, Phil was the inaugural HCRC professor in affordable housing economics, policy, and planning at the University of Hawaii. He came from Hawaii to Chicago, and I'm sure he's not regretting that whatsoever at this point in the season. He's been a visiting scholar at Russell Sage. He got his PhD, MA, and MSc all from Johns Hopkins. So we're pleased to welcome Phil to coauthored today. What's all yours?
Thank you all for coming and managing the cold and the post-Thanksgiving break to be here today. So I'm going to be talking about a chapter from the mentioned book, still a work in progress, that relates to lead paint litigation, right? Specifically in Baltimore, Maryland, using in-depth interviews with landlords and property managers operating in the local market. And what we're specifically looking at is what we're calling governing by litigation, right? Which is the process by which the enforcement of socially desirable outcome, in this case, lead paint remediation, is largely abdicated by government to lawsuits in the civil court. And we argue broadly that while the ability of low-income tenants to seek compensation when their children are exposed to lead paint due to the negligence of a rental property owner is obviously a fundamental justice issue, that the approach is poorly suited for achieving the broader socially desirable goal of removing the hazard from homes in Baltimore. We argue that lead lawsuits tend to be unevenly targeted. They focus exclusively on landlords for whom damages can be realistically extracted, and they result in enormous variability in landlord response, only a fraction of which involves the removal of lead paint. Okay. Well, before we get into the specific case, I want to talk a little bit about how this case of lead paint litigation is really emblematic of the state of the low-end rental market more generally. And specifically the challenges with the approach that we've taken for decades with our general refusal to make adequate funding available to subsidize low-income households and to rely primarily on a regulatory approach for housing outcomes. All right, so I'm sure everyone here is familiar with charts like this, right? This is from the Joint Center up at Harvard. And it's looking at the percentage of renters broken down by income quintile or convenient boxes. The percentage of them that are we call housing cost burden, right? Spending over 30, or in the case of the blue bar is 50% of their income on rent and utilities, right? And oftentimes the take home from graphics like this really focuses on the middle income and even sometimes the higher income renters, where we have seen over the last 20 years a quite stark increase in housing burdens in groups that, while not unaffected by high housing prices, were less the focus of housing policy up until fairly recently. But what's overlooked in these charts is the left side, right? Because there isn't much change over there, right? The fact that extremely low income households are perennially burdened and indeed have been so for decades. And if this chart went back into prior years, the trend would be indeed very gradual. So we have like the new problem of increasing burden for higher income renters. And we have the very old problem for the lowest income households of not being able to afford housing. And the fact that this problem exists really isn't that surprising. Even if we take the top end of the distribution here, folks making $15,000 a year, and we use the conventional calculation for what that family can afford in terms of rent and utilities, we come up with just $375 per month, okay? And the problem is that there are essentially no rental properties being offered at that rate, less utilities, that are unsubsidized in most rental markets, right? And we know this because we can actually look for rental properties in things like the American Housing Survey, the Residential Housing Finance Survey, which is what we used in our 2012 paper. And we can look to identify the few apartments that are being rented at this very low rent. And the ones that do exist tend to be highly anomalous, right? They never have debt service, they're rented to friends or family. It's sort of an accidental landlord doing something that, while technically qualifies as being a landlord, isn't sort of engaged in the rental market in a way that we would expect to be able to scale in any kind of meaningful policy way, okay? And indeed, the only reason that these bars are not all up at 100% for this entire group is that about 1 in 4 eligible renters receive some kind of housing subsidy, right? Either a housing choice voucher, or they live in a project-based Section 8 unit, or public housing, or public housing, or what have you, where their expenditures are more or less fixed at 30 to 40% of their income. And I should mention that this category is not some sort of anomalous group of extremely poor individuals or some sort of statistical error that you get with folks say reporting zero income. But about a quarter of renter households in Baltimore and about 17% of renter households in Chicago fall below this 15,000 mark. All right, so what does this mean? So basically, among very low income people, about 3/4 live in unsubsidized housing. And there's some debate about the statistics. Some people will say 4/5, some people will say it's less than 3/4. But I think, for our purposes, it's more or less accurate. This means that despite the fact that the private rental market cannot provide safe, secure, and affordable housing at that price point, they are in effect expected to do so for thousands and thousands of households in cities across the country. And what our larger project is about is more or less how landlords respond to that, how they attempt to provide profitable housing, right, to people who cannot afford to live in housing that can be profited on, right? And you might think that the answer here is simply to raise rents, right, beyond what people can afford. And the reason why these bars are also high is that is indeed a practice that landlords engage in. But two things limit their ability to solve this problem simply by rent increases, right? The first is the nature of segregation in American cities means that in many communities, the properties which landlords own and manage will not be inhabited by higher income individuals, right? Higher income individuals will have alternate choices in the metro area and they will move elsewhere. And so landlords are sort of capped at the incomes of the tenants they can attract simply by neighborhood segregation, stigma, what have you. They can, of course, continue to raise rent on those low-income households who live in that community. But above a certain point, you have this extreme trade-off between higher rents and lower consistency of rent payments, right? So when rents become far detached from individual incomes, lots of studies suggest that those individuals will do whatever they can to pay the rent, but after a certain point, you lead to high amounts of rent arrearage, which leads to eviction, all of which are very costly to landlords trying to operate. So in other words, even when pushing up rents as far as possible, landlords still ultimately need to solve the dilemma in other ways. And this is where all the negative aspects of the low-end rental market come crashing into the story, right? Under maintenance, screening tools that are either illegal or have disparate impacts on particular groups, management that involves high levels of surveillance and the constant threat of eviction. And some of these issues become so prevalent that they are addressed through regulation. And I don't want anyone to come away from the talk here saying that I'm somehow opposed to regulating the worst action of landlords. Quite the contrary. Even in markets where profits are easy to come by, of course, we would still need to regulate housing markets to restrict bad actors and other sort of behaviors. But in the low-end market, regulations help, but because they do not solve this fundamental dilemma, they do not create tenants with incomes who can afford to be profited from. We end up with this sort of decades that we've seen in these places of chasing our tail in terms of public policy, right? So that a more affirmative, more direct subsidy types of approaches are absolutely necessary for solving this. And that's what gets us back to lead paint, something that's obviously bad, right? It's something that's not desired by landlords, tenants, or the public at yards at large, but our attempts to get it out of homes has been remarkably slow. And in the case of the actual removal of lead, the public policy has relied on an extremely poor instrument of private litigation. Okay. Let's talk about data and methods. So I'm going to be talking primarily about Baltimore today, sort of help simplify the whole history of lead paint litigation and lead paint policy if I present just a single case. But the data we collected was in 4 cities: Baltimore, Maryland, Cleveland, Ohio, Dallas, Texas, and Washington, DC. And these were designed to provide a certain amount of heterogeneity of context, right? Baltimore is a poor city in a wealthy metropolitan area. Cleveland is by far the poorest city in our sample, which has some rich suburbs, but is largely, compared to Maryland metro, far less lucrative. But Dallas has a growing economy with pockets of deep poverty in the south and southwest of the city. And Washington, D.C. is a context in which you're seeing growth pressures, the likelihood of displacement, of gentrification occurring, and so forth. But I'm going to be focused on Baltimore for 2 reasons. First, as I said, it sort of simplifies the argument to just tell sort of one policy history here. Obviously, in Dallas, Texas, the housing stock is much newer, so lead came up much less frequently. This is not the case in Cleveland or Washington, D.C., but there is something, I think, somewhat special and therefore somewhat illuminating in Baltimore, Maryland, related to lead paint. It really has become sort of an ecology of concern there. You have landlords who the first thing out of their mouths when you start to talk to them is on the nature of lead paint litigation. You have lawyers who specialize in identifying and assisting tenants in collecting damages from landlords. And you have these sort of large scale ramifications for the rental market that were talked about in ways that are much more robust in Baltimore than others. That's not to say that landlords in Washington, D.C., especially older parts of those cities, did not mention their concerns about lead paint litigation in ways that echo what we'll be talking about today. All right.
No, sorry, could you just say a word about what those maps were showing?
Oh, sorry, these are just, yeah, it's a little small. Yeah, these are mostly illustrative, but these are poverty maps of the city.
Oh.
So Baltimore has this butterfly shaped poverty area. Cleveland has poverty throughout the city. Dallas has it in the south. DC has famously has it in the south. Yeah, I probably should just put out the borders just from so, but I don't think anyone recognizes the border of Dallas as like. Okay, so what do we do with these 4 places? Though the primary data, especially that I'll be talking about today, is we conducted open-ended, semi-structured interviews with these landlords, right? We sat down. We sat down and chatted with them, not just about their business, but about who they are, and specifically about all the choices they were making around how to profit in the context of high poverty places. We also did a lot of ethnographic field observations. We accompanied landlords as they went their day-to-day, right? This is very important to get people to sort of show us and not tell us just what they were doing. So one of the things that was most illustrative for this particular project was they would go out and look at potential investments, right? And one of the major things that they were sort of assessing when they were looking at these investments was whether or not there was lead paint in the unit, what it would cost to remediate that. And so it became a natural discussion around the choices they were making around lead paint when we were sort of looking and observing what they were looking at. We also did a lot of administrative data work for this project. Won't be talking about. So how did we sample the landlords that we spoke to? It was very important to us not just to use sort of a convenience or a snowball sample. There are lots of landlords in any city that are more than willing to talk to you. They're heads of real estate investment associations. They're folks who run organizations, sort of sell seminars and whatnot. Any sort of government agency will have landlords who they work with very frequently that they're happy to refer. But those folks are not necessarily representative of landlords operating in any city. So we use that heterogeneity sampling design to essentially stratify real estate listings across the city and then target our subsamples of landlords within each of the cells of that stratification. So we scraped real estate listings from two sources. We used one of the other issues of this project is around housing choice vouchers. So we scraped landlords participating in the housing choice voucher program from Go Section 8, which is now affordablehousing.com, and an idiosyncratic website called housingcleveland.com that was sort of serving the function of Go Section 8 in that city. And then we scraped unsubsidized listings, or not manifestly unsubsidized, but listings from Craigslist, almost none of which accepted housing choice vouchers. We threw away any rental listings that were, high-end luxury market, right? We weren't interested in the dynamics of rental housing in the Loop, right? We were interested in lower income areas. And then we stratified all these listings by neighborhood poverty rate and neighborhood racial plurality, creating sort of subsample cells that we targeted. And our response rate varied somewhat widely. We ended up getting close to 50% of the landlords in our sample in Cleveland and close to 75% in Baltimore, in between. So this was we really worked hard to try to get a representative set of, or not a representative, but a heterogeneous set of landlords. And I think we did achieve that, right? We talked to, that's why I said, updating 157 landlords across the 4 sites. We had a disproportionate number that accepted housing vouchers. Will come up in this presentation as a relevant sort of vector of difference. We talked to landlords, we talked to property managers, we talked to folks who did rehabbing and flipping, although in order to end up in our sample, they also had to be landlords. They're obviously not mutually exclusive categories. And importantly, I think we talked to very small landlords, and I don't use the word small landlords like they're short of stature, right? But landlords with very small portfolios tend to be more amateur. And we talked to property managers and owners of large rental property companies with hundreds of experiences. All right, so what are we? So I wanted to start with a bit of information on the case of lead paint in Baltimore, for those who are not familiar, which is most of you, but please, if you are familiar with lead paint in Baltimore, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And I should mention before I start presenting findings that there's obviously a difference, right, between the objective reality of lead paint law, right, and our respondents, landlords, perceptions of that law, right? So hopefully, first and foremost, we all understand that what we're presenting are the subjective assessments of landlords, because their subjective assessments are what's going to drive their strategic decisions, right? So even if they are misunderstanding the nature of lead paint law in Baltimore, if they believe something to be more punitive than it is or less punitive than it is, that will affect their outcomes. And then for any sort of factual information, obviously we triangulated that with a variety of secondary sources in the literature, reports from advocacy communities, other researchers. So, not to beat a dead horse on this, because that's sort of part of how I set up the whole thing, but the fundamental issue with lead paint in Baltimore's low-end rental market is what landlords sometimes call dead rental property, right? So dead rental property is dead for a lot of reasons. It's dilapidated, it's undesirable to anyone but the most desperate tenants. It has next to no market value, and for the most part, it's full of lead paint. And I think it can be hard sometimes, and this should not be a problem on the south side of Chicago, but to other audiences, for individuals living in more prosperous places to understand just how little demand there is in high poverty areas of cities like Baltimore. So during our fieldwork, there are 16,000 abandoned residential structures in Baltimore. Nearly all of these homes were trapped in the reality that the after rehab value, right? So would be less than the minimum investment necessary to bring them up to code, right? So if someone came to me and said, hey, do you want this house for free? I would say no, because if I put the money I needed to put into it to get it to have a use and occupancy permit, it would then appraise at less than my expenses to do that, right? So these properties have incredibly low value. Dollar house programs are successful in some areas, but they're very idiosyncratic in places like Baltimore. So Thomas, a long-term owner of low-end rental properties, says a lot of times it would cost you more to remove it, meaning lead, than the cost of the house. meaning that the estimated, and you'll see slightly different estimates from different respondents as we go through the presentation, but the estimated $30,000 to $50,000 necessary to make a home lead-free, which is different from lead-safe, I'll talk about that in a second, far exceeds the current value of many of these properties. So this is the fundamental issue, again, albeit framed from the supply side. All of the landlords we spoke to would love to have the lead magically removed from their properties, but there's a fundamental mismatch in high poverty communities between the costs of full remediation and the value of lead-free properties. So let's look at a little bit at the last 75 years of lead paint litigation in Baltimore, or rather, I'll keep saying Baltimore by default, but I mean Maryland. Maryland is the jurisdiction that governs lead paint law. There's a lot of debate about when exactly the hazards of lead paint became well known. Similar to cigarettes, right? There's evidence that the manufacturers of lead paint, explicitly minimized and created studies to sort of obfuscate the problems with it. But by the 1950s, cities, and actually starting with Maryland, began banning its use in new construction. Of course, by this point, you look at the average age of homes in Baltimore, nearly every city property in the city was contaminated. And there's evidence that lead paint continued to be used up until the 1970s, which is where the law was later amended. So for quite a while after this ban, not much occurred, or rather quite a lot was happening, not from the policy sphere, right? Kids were getting very sick, but there's an abundance of evidence about the consequences of lead paint poisoning on all manner of social and economic outcomes in our cities. And in response to that, lawsuits started to be leveled against landlords. But there wasn't much, sort of public intervention until the 1990s. By this point, lead paint lawsuits had become a significant issue in Baltimore, and property insurance companies stopped covering lead liability, right? So as Thomas here points out, insurance companies traditionally cover lawsuits against landlords for cases like a trip and fall, or as it says, if a ceiling fan falls on somebody's head. But lead paint lawsuits specifically became far too frequent and far too expensive, and so insurance companies removed them from their policies going forward. This, combined with the growing awareness of the public health crisis, prompted the Maryland Lead Law, or officially the Maryland Reduction in Lead Risk in Housing Law. It did many things, but it did two important things. First, landlords with properties built before 1950 needed to implement a lead-safe protocol. This is basically a visual inspection of the property, no peeling paint, no big cracks in the walls, and a dust test to ensure that there was no obvious sources of contamination. And they needed to do this every time they turned over a unit. In exchange, the maximum damages that a lead paint lawsuit against the landlord could garner were capped at $17,000, so long as landlords had implemented this lead-safe protocol. And this was very much framed as an incentive for landlords to do lead-safe work. As Anthony, another Baltimore landlord, puts it, they threw a bone to the property owners. The idea is that if you do the work and you pay all this money and you comply with the law, we will give you liability protection where the tenants can't sue. And as much as all of the landlords we spoke to obviously approved of this liability cap, I think, in some ways it can be a fairly shocking piece of public policy, right? Civil court damages are not like fines and fees, right? They're not actually designed specifically to be an incentive. They're meant to provide resources to the individuals harmed by negligent activities of others, right? So capping damages did incentivize lead-safe implementation, but it did so by limiting access to justice for poor families whose children were suffering from lead paint poisoning. And so it's hardly surprising that about 15 years later, in the Jackson versus Ackman case, it was ruled by the Maryland Appeals Court as unconstitutional, state constitution. Now, not a lawyer, I don't, can't speak to this. This does seem like the right decision, given that $17,000, I mean, inflation adjusted, but nonetheless, is very small considering the long-term care that needs to be provided to some families caring for a child suffering lead paint poisoning, and the long-term economic impact of having early childhood lead paint poisoning certainly exceeds $17,000. But regardless of the rightness of this judicial decision, this decision created havoc for landlords, right? As Anthony points out, it was even worse than if they hadn't had this to begin with. landlords thought they had liability protection and they couldn't get sued, and then it opened them up. It's something that happened 8 years ago. He was talking to us, something that happened 8 years ago, and you thought you had liability protection. Now you may longer have, right? So this is the policy world in which we did our data collection. There's been no insurance available to landlords to cover lead paint damages for quite some time, and there's no longer a cap on damages in the case of lead paint poisoning. And these things together would, one might expect, right, create an enormous incentive for full remediation to make a house lead-free, not just lead-safe. But as we will show, this did not. I do want to be clear when I talk about what there was progress on and what there wasn't, right? The lack of progress has been primarily in making properties lead-free, right? Removing lead from the homes or making, I think there's like a 1-inch, 2-inch depth rule that if it's sufficiently buried, behind like a brick wall or something, it's okay. But the rules around lead safe, right? That units must be inspected at turnover, combined with widespread testing of young children that was also implemented statewide during this period, has proved successful at addressing some of the public house crisis. The lead is still there, but the rate at which children are getting poisoned, despite increased prevalence of testing, is much lower. And I think this is sort of a key point that I'll come back to later. The lead safe law had teeth in the process, right? Landlords had to have a certification or risk penalties. And most of what is needed to make a property lead safe is somewhat what landlords do anyway at turnover, right? You paint, you clean, whatnot. It's imperfect to be sure, and the current rate of 400 cases, most recent data, 400 cases a year, is still a problem. But the reduction over since 2000 from 2,200 cases a year of child lead poisoning is real and important progress. But the issue here is what to do with the estimated 85,000 occupied homes that still contain lead paint, and for which there is no incentive beyond the threat of litigation to make the property lead-free. All right, so why has the threat of, as landlords would phrase it, catastrophic litigation not proven more successful in addressing the crisis? Well, it's important to understand first and foremost how lead paint lawsuits are conducted, or at least how landlords believe lead paint lawsuits are conducted, right? So in an ideal world, lawsuits would be directed against only the most negligent landlords who own properties in which children were poisoned. But this can be hard to determine in advance, given how many contexts a child might have been exposed to lead paint. So landlords report that lawyers take a shotgun approach to filing lawsuits, what Liam here describes as spaghetti against the wall. So what happens, quote, so what happens is a lot of these lawyers, they advertise in the papers, did you live in a house like this? They have up to the age when a child turns 21 to file a lawsuit. So they start soliciting, a lot of them maybe at 17, 18, 19. If you, the landlord, were in the chain of title any time that they think the tenant might have lived there, so the house has turned hand a lot, what have you, here you go, you can sue 4 or 5 people. As long as the tenant lived there in that range, there you go, right? So this leads to a variety of complex patterns in lawsuits. First and foremost, lawyers almost never go after owner occupants, right? Who are, after all, not compelled to make their properties even lead safe, never mind lead free. But these are poor targets for litigation because, first of all, they have minimal assets, and second of all, they're often connected to the parent and child, family, friend, what have you. So that's an enormous part of the housing stock that goes almost entirely ignored. But the reality is that a similar logic operates with landlords. Small amateur landlords may very well have hazards in their units, and there's lots of evidence that they do, but they're not worth much as a target of litigation since they won't be able to pay. So suits tend to focus on larger, more established landlords who have resources, but also a negative reputation in the city. So in other words, what sticks, to continue with the spaghetti analogy, isn't necessarily the most irresponsible party, but instead the one that has the highest potential for collection. As Mark, a large-scale landlord who we're about to meet in more detail, put it, if you can't collect against the guy, he doesn't get sued. So we already have this uneven distribution of enforcement. Unlike, say, a housing inspection regime, right, the choice of targets is not driven by a publicly determined process of triage, but by assessing legal targets that are most likely to pay damages. And again, here I want to emphasize this is not a criticism of the victims of lead paint poisoning, right? A family with a poisoned child will incur enormous costs and not be entirely aware necessarily of where that poisoning occurred. So it's totally expected they would pursue any legal action that would help them. So the problem is not the presence of lead paint lawsuits, right? It's the reliance on lead paint lawsuits to try to spur action. Right? So how do landlords respond? Well, the ideal scenario is that they remove all the lead paint from their units. This does more, as they point out, than protect them from future lawsuits, right? It also makes it very difficult for current and past lawsuits to succeed, as they're literally removing the evidence of paint from the property. But as I already mentioned, we saw a robust commitment to remediation only in a fraction of the landlords we talked to. Others chose a higher risk strategy of trying to screen likely litigants out of their units, so avoiding families with young children or those who had been involved in previous litigation. And finally, we saw a significant exodus of larger scale landlords from the city, not corporate owners, not sort of business, large corporate entities that you might have heard about in the rental housing space, like Blackstone and what have you, but old school owners with hundreds of properties, right? Some just abandoned their properties, but most sold to small amateur landlords who were less vulnerable to landlords and frankly, extremely ignorant of their exposure. So let's look at the sort of the good story here, right? Let's look at the folks who do remediate. And remember, these are, we're not talking about folks with properties in low poverty, Tony neighborhoods where, there's a whole different set of incentives and so forth. These are still folks who own properties in high poverty area. So we have Mark. So Mark is a managing partner at a company with hundreds of single family rental properties across the city. He's not, private entity. He's not coming from the outside. His business is very homegrown within Baltimore, but it's grown to be highly professional and well capitalized. Mark has a lot going for him, right, when it comes to the likelihood that he'll invest in remediation. First, his company is fairly public. He collaborates with the city and the housing authority, so he feels that he has a reputation to maintain that lead paint lawsuits would undermine. He also bases the vast majority of his business on the Housing Choice Voucher program, aka Section 8, right? And this is actually one of the more effective ways to solve what I mentioned at the beginning, this fundamental dilemma. And he's able to get fairly higher rents than most landlords in areas, than most landlords in the areas in which he works. He also notes in the quote that he has an in-house general contracting firm, right? He's reached a scale where he no longer hires, third-party contractors that does all of his lead remediation work. And this saves him a lot of money and allows him to remove lead paint far more expeditiously. For all these reasons, Mark says, quote, "We can actually make money being good landlords." But this was indeed a lot of money. Mark estimates that he invested about $3 million in lead paint remediation, moving tenants out of units, pulling out the lead one by one. He couldn't, importantly, finance this against the value of the houses. Those were highly leveraged, like a lot of rentals. He pulls money out of a house to buy the next house. But his company had $3 million in reserves, which is an incredibly rare thing in many of these markets. So about 5 years and $3 million later, he says, quote, "Now we can sleep at night. That we got, a pretty low percentage, only 25% of our portfolio is still in need of lead abatement." And he thinks that there are probably two-thirds of that 25% that probably would be limited lead-free if they bothered to get the inspection at the time of turnover. So they think we've, quote, "substantially mitigated our lead paint risk." So this is the ideal outcome, right? One of the very few, unfortunately, we have in our sample. And the reason it's rare is somewhat obvious. Landlords in Baltimore are buying and selling $50,000 to $150,000 homes. Very few of them have the sort of money they need to invest in full remediation. So they abide by the lead safe law rather than lead free and hope to get lucky and avoid litigation. But they can do more than just get lucky. Several landlords we spoke to talked about reducing the risk of lawsuits by screening away tenants that might be likely to sue. This includes households with previous evidence of litigation, but also families with young children. So here's Diva. Like Mark, she owns many single-family rental properties, and she does provide a fairly high-end product, albeit primarily subsidized with the voucher program, right? So Diva's strategy in the market is almost entirely based on screening. She really looks for a very specific subset of low-income tenants, primarily those with housing vouchers, who are not going to turn over their units, not going to be engaged in other things that Diva views as unprofitable. And in order to achieve that, she actually boasts of having a 90-question questionnaire that they need to fill out when they apply. And there's all sorts of things on this questionnaire about the way that they do housekeeping, about sort of romantic partners, all sorts of other things. But one of the key things on this relates to lead paint history and litigation. She says, one of my questions is, has your children been tested for lead? Okay. Have you ever sued any of your landlords? And by tested, she means has an elevated blood lead level. I mean, all children are tested. If so, there's no way you're coming into my unit, right? So because she does not have the resources, at least yet, in her business to invest in free remediation, she chooses to, one, treat her tenants really well, try to use sort of social coercion to prevent lawsuits, but most importantly, she screens away tenants who might be likely to sue her, or she views as more likely to sue her. And finally, we have this selective exodus of so-called old school landlords due, at least in part, to lead paint litigation. So Mark noted when he was describing his fellow larger landlords, he said there was a massive transfer of real estate in Baltimore City from the older landlord group, many of whom were members of property associations, public figures, not necessarily good reasons, infamous public figures in many cases, to all this disparate ownership of weekend warrior and newbie landlords, almost whom you can categorize as fairly amateur. And like anything else, this transition has complex trade-offs, but it in no way benefits remediation, right? A lot of these low income, these small amateur guys are done other work on this particular subgroup of owners, really don't know anything about being a landlord. They're being convinced by sort of late night television infomercials that all money can be made in real estate. Our once and future president has a whole book sort of convincing folks of the value of investing in real estate. And they get sort of caught up in this idea that they can, break out of the sort of rat race and achieve financial independence through doing this. But that doesn't mean they have any skills to be an actual landlord. They don't know anything about lead paint. They don't have any idea what their exposure is, and they don't know how to, improve a property. So by transferring from these large amateur landlords who are stubbornly not renovating their properties and making them lead free, you're not achieving through any sort of progress towards a lead-free Baltimore environment. You're simply sort of scattering responsibility amongst a group of people who are harder targets for litigation. So here we have John, who's exactly one of those old school landlords who had gotten out of the Baltimore rental market, not entirely, obviously, that's why we talked to him, but for the huge portion of his portfolio, just a few years before we spoke with him. He talks about this sort of like dream turned nightmare of being a landlord, right? Of sipping a margarita on Miami Beach only to suddenly be hit by a lead paint lawsuit. He rehashes a bunch of arguments about why he's not at fault for such things. I ended up having to, sort of for time reasons, take this out of the talk, but there's obviously a lot of talk from these landlords about how they're not responsible for lead paint, how they're not negligent, even when obviously many of them, or some of them at least, are quite negligent, right? There's this sort of, moral script of passing the buck in terms of who's responsible. You see this in terms of accusing families of poor housekeeping or accusing sort of other facets of the built environment as being responsible for the poisoning. But anyway, there's a lot of that too, so he engages that here. But regardless of the sort of moral work that he's doing to legitimate his behaviors, it ultimately comes down to sort of dollars and cents. He says, so who wants to be in a business where you can get sued like that? Nobody. Stockbrokers look at us like we're crazy. Why would you want to be in a business like that? Making a property lead free can add $6,000 to $10,000 more to the rehab costs. So this is in addition to the rehab costs, not that alone. Otherwise, you've got $4 million lawsuits looking at you a few years down the road. Why? Who wants to do that? So John actually did leave the market, selling the majority of his rental portfolio in Baltimore, and he didn't sell to those who, unlike him, were willing to invest in remediation. By his own admission, he sold to people who didn't know what they were getting into, quote, people who aren't familiar with the law. All right. So to sum up, all right, so lead paint in Baltimore's rental properties is a persistent and enormously expensive problem. This leads to regulatory regime that, at least in part, attempts to incentivize remediation through the threat of lawsuits. When used this way, the impact of litigation is extremely uneven, and landlords respond in a range of ways. Some well-capitalized professional landlords invest in remediation, while others exit the rental market or attempt to avoid riskier penalties. All right, so what can be sort of done? Is there a better option here? personally argue that there is. And remember, the goal here is not first and foremost to decide who should be on the hook for lead paint lawsuits. As I mentioned, the sort of existence of a civil court system whereby tenants can seek damages for negligence of their landlords is an incredibly important piece of justice. But the goal, I think, more broadly, is to keep children from being poisoned and to remove lead paint from homes. One of the nice things about forward mediation is that once it's gone, it's gone. It's unlike some other issues in landlording where a new owner can come in and sort of re-implement policies that are deleterious. And I've argued sort of for a more proactive approach across the board. But unfortunately, this cannot mean simply funding remediation, right? Estimates suggest that to fully remove all lead from all homes in Baltimore would cost 2.5 to 4.2 billion dollars. That's about $7,000 from every man, woman, and child in the city. In other words, that's impossible. And that includes both rental housing and ownership housing as well. But I would contend there's a lot of space between full public funding of remediation and the uneven process that litigation produces. And I think the answer here is somewhat in what's already being done, right? And it's first and foremost to implement a proactive enforcement, of a lower bar, in this case, lead safe, right? When combined with near universal testing, this can be fairly effective at reducing the incidence of lead paint poisoning, even if it is incredibly slow to actually remove lead from homes. But in addition to this, right, we can see in Mark's case that there's a set of circumstances that could make lead paint remediation a profitable strategy. One that the stick of litigation alone appears not to be enough to make substantial progress, right? Mark has first and foremost solved the profitability problem by leveraging government subsidies and economies of scale, right? So there's plenty of reason to expect that expansions of housing subsidies and the voucher program will promote better outcomes beyond affordability, at least at the margins, right? But we also need to pay attention to the biggest barrier, one that Mark is somewhat unique in having solved, which is access to capital, right? This wouldn't be a free solution, right? Not that any of these solutions are free. After all, banks won't lend for lead paint remediation simply because it's not profitable to do so. But the availability of low to zero cost loans for remediation, a program which could also include homeowners, could accelerate this process, right? You could target, for example, subsidies, incentives, low interest loans, capital investments with other beneficial outcomes for rental property owners, affordability, restrictions, what have you, to facilitate this process. With such a program in place, we could then be much more aggressive with code enforcement, because those not in compliance would no longer be able to claim that they no longer have options, but be actual bad actors who are looking to take advantage of the system in the city. So in general, I think, this is the sort of concluding idea here, right? Is that in terms of lead paint remediation, we have chosen perhaps the most passive option policy-wise as possible. There is about $5 to $9 million from HUD each year that gets invested in lead paint. Almost none of it goes, if any of it goes to landlords. And so in terms of actually removing lead paint from homes, we ultimately only have the solution of the threat of litigation, right? And we should not be surprised, therefore, that the actual problem is so durable, right? And so, I've done, I think, a fairly mediocre job in exploring all of the different options for a particular policy that could be more proactive. But the point I really want to drive home is that there needs to be this proactive investment, both in the enforcement and monitoring side, but also in facilitating remediation. So with that, I will conclude and look forward to questions.
Could you go back to the graph of the lead cases, the lead cases decreasing since 2000? Yeah, that graph. I don't know. I thought this graph was really interesting because I guess it starts at 2000, but we know the gov policy was implemented in 1996, the liability cap. So I guess I was curious, your recommendation is for more kind of, I guess you didn't necessarily support that policy, but more types of intervention policies kind of similar to the liability cap that are positive incentives for landlords to pursue lead safety. So I wondered if there's any, can we look at this graph and say that some of this decrease could be attributed to the 1996 policy? Like, how much do we know came about as a result of that policy, and what does that kind of tell us as we look at legislation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have not seen, obviously, this paper is not a causal analysis of the impacts of these various policies. And I've not seen a good one out there. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. My take home on this graph is that this is primarily a function of the lead safe policy, right? The fact that you have to do this dust test when folks move into the unit, which of course is very incomplete, right? If you stay in a unit for many, many years and you have young children, lead paint hazards emerge as they will. And of course, it doesn't touch homeowners. So the combination of that, and it's called universal testing. It only covers about 50 to 60% of young children in the city, which happens, through pediatricians and through school type mechanisms. My explanation for this drop is primarily that. I do not think that either the implementation of that cap, nor I don't think you see much in the way of a discontinuity when you remove that cap from that had much impact on this particular. Right? But that's just, I'm just talking my perspective. Yeah.
So one, I'm from Baltimore and
oh, great.
Hopkins, so this was,
oh,
yeah. Hear about home. My question, I think, is I wanted to know if you saw any patterns in what led certain kinds of landlords to pursuing certain kinds of strategies, like how to handle it. It sounded like remediation was sort of saved for the more wealthy landlords, but I'm curious about the other two as well. There.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So yes, the full remediation was only the large, well-capitalized landlords. And sometimes someone would buy it and they'd want to flip it, so they'd end up renovating it. And anyway, although homeownership and lead paint is also not a great system either. But yeah, primarily remediation we saw for folks with the capital reserves to do so, right? It's not something you can necessarily lend on. I'd say the capital reserves and the business strategies, the effective business strategies. The screening only works when you have the capacity to be picky with your tenants. So Diva is not alone in this. There are plenty of landlords in Baltimore who attempt to sort of pursue profitability through screening. And in order to do that, you need to provide a fairly desirable product, and you need to, usually that involves having a housing voucher because too desirable and you're out of the price point of the people on some of those folks. And so Diva is able to be very picky because, and I've been in her units, they're lovely. They have granite countertops, they have fancy backsplashes, they have everything that you would wish. It's problematic when you look at voucher program expenses, but that's a separate talk. So she can be very picky, and she is willing to sort of put up with vacancy. For the small guys, these are the guys who really aren't doing anything about it. They're just sort of hoping that nothing happens. They're not necessarily maintaining their properties very well. And they're also not really able to screen particularly effectively because they have undesirable properties. So at least in the Baltimore case, many of the sort of small amateur landlords that Mark is talking about, they have the lowest end sort of properties. They can't be selective with their tenants. If they tried to be as selective as Diva, they would have a 6-month vacancy, right? And so they end up just sort of taking folks, and that's probably the majority of the landlords we talk to just do this sort of put the blinders up and they pretend it's not a problem thing. And they're not entirely wrong because they're less likely to be sued because they're sort of invisible to this. John's, these are all pseudonyms, obviously. I don't remember to say it, the pseudonyms, not the real names. Then the Johns of the world who have this large negative reputation. This is the group for which the term slumlord was, designed to leverage. So they're acutely aware of their exposure.
Are there jurisdictions who are doing a good job of this and that have policies that are more effective? And if so, what are?
I don't. Well, so Robin might know better than I do. Not in our sample, right? I mean, we have jurisdictions that are don't have a problem as much because the housing stock is newer. But I think by and large, for this and a lot of other sort of housing quality issues, there's been a real resistance to any kind of systemic investment of public dollars to improve low-end rental properties. And I understand the reason for that is that it's sort of politically unpopular. You're investing money in a profit-making business, right? Which you do for small businesses all the time, but investing your money in a landlord's property, and there needs to be a mechanism to make it politically viable by which you're ensuring that sort of money returns to the public coffers. But for years, people have been sort of promoting, if we do desire small, more small landlords who do have, closer social relationships with their tenants, do have different practices around eviction. If we do desire that, then we need to think about how we're sort of structuring a support system for them to sustain in the market when they're competing with guys like Mark's a good example, or the sort of large corporate owners, right? And so I don't know of any jurisdictions. There's a few, LA sort of trying a few things out. I don't know of any jurisdictions that are making sort of robust commitment to sort of preserving the low end housing stock in the sort of small ownership profile that it is currently existing. But in terms of lead painting specifically, I can't name a better example. There may be one.
Is there any nonprofit sector involved in remediation, like a habitat and a DIY almost?
There
Small landlords?
in Chicago there is somewhat for renovations. I don't know about how they handle that, but not that was in evidence in Baltimore. Like the habitats were all focused on low income home ownership when we were there. But you would think there could be some sort of, whether it's a community-based sort of endogenous group. And this is, I think, what they're experimenting with in LA is creating sort of communities of small landlords that have ties to the actual community in which they're operating, which the research do show have all these positive attributes in terms of tenants, and seeing if they can collectively engage, larger institutions to sort of preserve themselves. But in our data, there wasn't any nonprofit. There are not a lot of nonprofits that do advocacy around lead paint poisoning, but none that are explicitly working for with the small landlords to make these changes.
Very interesting. We want to hear more about your policy implementation. What can we do? You said that it shouldn't be like a dichotomy, black and white, like a full public investment or private investment. What, based on your findings, would you think it's better to put the efforts on the companies? I understood that the problem is more with the private individuals that don't really know what it means to be. They think like it's getting like a gold eggs from, and they don't understand what obligations they have. So maybe to educate them or something that is not even subsidized, is going directly, maybe indirect.
Yeah, landlord education is a key part of this, and something that's been advocated for a while is, if we don't have the political will to invest sort of actual resources, not that education is free, but in these small landlords, can we at least sort of train them in best practices? Can we do things that sort of help them understand what it means to make a property safe, or how to make it, do a better job with renovations? I think that could help. I think the big issue with the small landlords, and this is nationwide, is how you get them to come to things and show up. They're not, some of them are members of the Property Owners Association, some of them are members of, the Baltimore Real Estate Investment Association, things like that. But, most of them are just incredibly difficult, as Chris knows, like to access, to find, to figure out where they even live. And so sort of ways to reach out to them and educate them on scale have been really struggling. Barrier. I do think that access to capital is a huge barrier here. And the nice thing about access to capital is you do create a sphere in which, you're providing, deeply discounted lending, and that there might be opportunities to then sort of, to both help that small landlord remove that from their home, but also sort of ensure that that property, say, remains affordable for a certain number of years, or until the loan is paid off, or have some forgiveness program based on affordability. This is not a paper where I get through all the nitty-gritty trade-offs of that, but I do think it seems like that access to capital thing is a really critical thing, and especially when you have an asset that really the only value to you is the cash flow. It doesn't have much in the way of value that you can borrow off of, and you've already borrowed off of it at scale. So I think that seems most promising.
We have a question from Tiffany Smith. She's asking, are CDFIs having any impact on increasing access to capital to address the issue for the small mom and pop landlords? And also, have we seen local organizations partnering with banks to lend for CRA credit?
I don't see either of those things happening in our data. I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, I can't see it either.
So the question is, are CDFIs having any impact on increasing access to capital to address the issue for the small mom and pop landlords? And also, have we seen local organizations partnering with banks to lend for CRA credit?
I think those are both, again, I didn't see that happening in Baltimore in my data, and nor not through the interviews or through sort of like other stakeholder types of engagement. That doesn't mean it wasn't happening at some scale. I think there's a lot of challenges around, and this is where my, access to capital maybe becomes more challenging, right? Is that there are issues with, again, accessing these small landlords, getting them to participate in programs. They are so sort of used to that invisibility that sometimes they worry that participating in these programs make them more visible. So those programs can be very successful with a targeted set of landlords, and therefore we should deploy that as we should for access to capital. But I would wonder how much could move the needle for the sort of like overall thing. But those are great questions, and I'll follow up.
I was just wondering about the overall nature of these litigation findings. Like clearly the landlord can get fined, but then what happens to the property? Like the property has been kind of deemed to be a property that had this negative impact. Is some kind of lien put on that building? It can no longer be rented, or I mean, I guess I'm thinking like, what are the additional impacts that this has on the overall availability of these?
Yeah, well, there's certainly no sort of proactive investment, and there are there are about 2,500 properties in Baltimore that have sort of open lead paint hazard notices on them. So I would imagine that would happen in the case of this. But you also have to remember a lot of these litigation happens many years after the child was supposedly poisoned, right? So that's another way I didn't mention that there's such a blunt instrument for actually resulting in remediation, is that these are properties that may have changed hands many times, may have different owners at this point. And as Rose points out, like you're on the chain of title during that time, but that doesn't mean that you're actively responsible for that party. So I would imagine that where they were finding, so that's what I know about that question.
I was just curious, for buildings where the lead issues have been remediated, do landlords like advertise their units as, no longer having lead? Is this a thing that could be sort of capitalized?
Yeah, I mean, you would hope, in some ways you would hope that remediation dollars would be able to be capitalized into the price, right? And that they would be able to charge a premium for that. They did not talk about doing that, and you don't really see that, at least at that time, in sort of advertisements that we scraped. So what that says to me is that from a tenant's perspective, the nature of sort of looking for housing in these markets is so much about finding someone that will accept you, that you're not necessarily willing to pay, because that's not necessarily a thing that makes it more appealing. But it would be interesting to see if it would move the needle for the folks who have trouble filling units, if there could be some evidence that they would do that. Yeah, it's hard because obviously once you do a full remediation, the property is now newly renovated, so it wouldn't be apples to apples just from the lead paint remediation thing. But it would be interesting to see from a number of responses to an advertisement, sort of like a reverse audit study, whether you saw an increase in advertisements.
Question. So it's this, like, methodologically, you're really coming at this from looking at the landlords and speaking with them and using that to make projections about the promises and pitfalls of this private litigation. Did you speak to any of the tenants, particularly any that might have had experience with private litigation?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to lots of tenants in other projects. We did not do a selective subsample of tenants who were on that side. I think that would be a really interesting study. I'm also, while we're thinking about sort of adding to the sample, I think talking to some of these attorneys who specialize in this work, who obviously landlords dislike amongst all people, right? But that doesn't mean that, and some of them may be sort of, your top dog litigation style of folks, but I think a lot of them are good faith social justice lawyers who are trying to help tenants, deal with this huge medical crisis in their midst. So yeah, I think both those groups would be really important to sort of access for this type of work. Be difficult, when you sample sort of tenants generally, because a lead paint litigation case, despite how much it sort of looms large in landlord lives because it's so large, right? They are few and far between in terms of especially successful ones for the tenants. So how one would sample that population without HIPAA violation is the one that would be really complicated, but certainly could be done through the right means.
So my sense is that that lead paint is particularly a danger to young children.
Yeah.
Not to adults and not even to older children. And given that, and given the economics as you laid them out, the screening seems like a more positive process than I think at least how you described it, insofar as like one possible solution to this problem is to simply say a home that contains lead paint cannot be rented to a tenant that has a young child. And given that essentially the lead-free homes are a limited resource, we'd like them to be kind of, we'd like to sort people into those who really need the lead-free home and those that don't. So I guess it seems to me, I guess it's not positive, it's just some form of discrimination.
Right, but it does have the benefit of keeping them
landlord,
out.
but in terms of a public policy that simply said homes that have tested positive for lead paint can't be rented, families with children below whatever the age is at which, you know, it's a risk, would, I mean, I know it's not first best, but
Right.
it would certainly save a lot of the costs that, as you described them, are just not viable in the market and allow something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder how much that runs against fair housing issues and, you know, discrimination. You can't discriminate against families with children unless you're under very specific things. And so I wonder if that restriction, essentially restriction on the access to housing for families with children might run afoul of that piece of things. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of as a palliative solution, potentially, I can see prioritizing that. I mean, what you couldn't do was to say for the lead-free stuff that it would have to go to young children, right? Unless you had some kind of subsidy in there. So yeah, you're sort of restricting choice for young children, you know, in a paternalistic, as you would say, perhaps ultimately beneficial way, while not expanding the options for them on the back end. I can see how that might run afoul of some fair housing things, but yeah, it's interesting. And I mean, in Diva's case, I mean, of all the units we were in, I feel like you're least likely to get paint poisoning in Diva's units than others. So, you know, she's got the capacity to screen out, whereas the landlord that might accept them would have a lower level of, might equally be likely to have lead paint. She just is able to sort of screen out to be doubly protected in that instance. So yeah, I have to think more about that. Kelly.
Who's obligated to who's to blame? Not so much.
Yeah.
You mentioned to surprise corresponding states who tackle these successful and one obviously the healthcare costs and those lawsuits include healthcare costs for different things. And then, you know, you think about like FEMA funds, so we are being the government should go in disaster zones to subsidize costs of disaster because people are not involved. But of course, people are living in areas that we know probably going to be a disaster is much. What we decide is this is like we as a whole should subsidize. So I'm just wondering if you find movement to because like the cost of $2 billion sounds like that multiple right? But if you put it at large, this is probably the West, the cost doesn't.
Yeah.
Just curious.
No. So that's a great question. And yeah, that sort of gets into when I was talking about how like landlords do talk a lot about this sort of like why they're not to blame. And you know, they're not getting sued because they house ever had lead paint in it. They're getting sued because they're not mitigating the hazard as required by law. So there's a lot of complexities there, but they do conflate, they do argue that suing them for lead paint poisoning is like suing 7-Eleven when you get cancer, right? And that we didn't do that, right? We sued the manufacturers of cigarettes. We did not sue the distributors of cigarettes or the implementers of cigarettes, right? And that the lead paint companies were like left off the hook here. My understanding is that the lead paint companies did pay some damages in some specific things, but nothing at the scale that we saw with tobacco or other other things. And my understanding of that history was it was just the power of lobbying and the power of sort of like being able to frame the conversation at that time. At this point, 75 years later, it's unclear whether, you know, who would be left to sue and all those types of questions. But yeah, it was absolutely an open question at them, you know, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s when these issues were coming to a fore, whether or not it should be exactly that. And landlords still very much believe that they didn't put the lead paint in these properties, right? It was there. They've attempted to mitigate it by law, right? How is that negligent on their part? Well, yeah, it depends on case by case. And you should mention that every landlord who's sued, you know, they make it sound like if they get sued, they lose $4 million, right? But you know, there is a judicial process here, and there's evidence that needs to be brought up. And so it's, you know, really we're talking about the threat of litigation in many ways that they're, you know, afraid of, because a single loss is devastating. But yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point, and there hasn't. I don't. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are sort of researchers and public health advocates who have made the case that it sort of would have been logical to do that. My sense of the field right now is that people view that as like, that was a ship that has sailed, and at this point, it seems unlikely that I do that, and they're gonna focus on what actually generates benefits to their, you know, to the children that they are fighting for, and that's the landlords are the ones that are left over to just sue in these cases. But I could, yeah, there might be a movement out there that I'm not aware of to do that.
Well, thank you, Phil. Thank you
Thank
for
you,
the
yeah.
enlightening talk.